"What do you recommend?" he asked. "Well, sir, most of the boys would just post some signs and maybe hire a few extra hands to ride the boundaries. Make it clear that this is private property and folks ought to respect it. And if they don't—" Jake's weathered face tightened slightly. "Then we'll speak with them directly, Mr. Blackwood. It's your land after all, and we can guide them off if need be." Harrison nodded absently, but his thoughts had already moved elsewhere. Through his window, he could see Marcus sitting on the porch steps, still in his nightclothes despite the late morning hour, reading what appeared to be a book of poetry. The sight should have irritated him, a young man of good, family lounging about when there was work to be done, but instead it filled him with a familiar sadness. When had they stopped talking about anything that mattered? When had their conversations become nothing but disagreements about responsibility and tradition and the importance of carrying on the family name? Harrison could remember holding Marcus as a baby, making plans for all the things they would do together, fishing, hiking, riding the boundaries of their land. But somehow, those plans had been pushed aside by the demands of business, replaced by boarding schools and tutors, and the assumption that success would naturally follow from privilege. "Mr. Blackwood?" Jake's voice brought him back to the present. "What would you like me to do about the situation in the northern range?" "Let me think about it," Harrison replied. "I'd like to see the area for myself before we make any decisions." Jake looked surprised. In all the years he had worked for Harrison, the boss had rarely involved himself in such routine matters. "If you say so, sir. When would you like to ride out there?" "Tomorrow morning," Harrison decided impulsively. "Early, and Jake, I'll be going alone." "Alone, sir? That's not advisable. It's rough country up there, and if there really are folks camped out—" "I can manage," Harrison interrupted, his tone making it clear that the discussion was over. "Just have my horse ready at dawn." After Jake left, Harrison returned to the window and watched his son, who was now lying on his back in the grass, the book propped open above his face. There was something peaceful about the scene, something that reminded Harrison of his own boyhood before the weight of expectation and inheritance had settled on his shoulders. Perhaps a ride into the mountains would clear his head, help him think through not just the business situation, but the larger questions that had been troubling him. What kind of legacy was he really building? What would it mean if Marcus truly had no interest in continuing the family tradition? And why did the thought of asking people to leave land they might consider home sit so uneasily with him? The morning air carried the crisp bite of autumn as Harrison urged his horse up the narrow mountain trail, following the path his surveyor had marked on the crude map tucked inside his jacket. The ride had taken him farther from the ranch house than he had ventured in years. Through dense stands of pine and aspen that gradually gave way to more rugged terrain, dotted with granite outcroppings and hidden valleys. He had left before dawn, as promised, saddling his favorite mare without bothering to wake any of the hands. The solitude felt strange, after years of being surrounded by employees and obligations, but it also brought a clarity that had been missing from his daily routine. Up here, away from the constant demands of business and the tension with Marcus, he could think more clearly about the choices that lay ahead. The surveyor's map indicated that the main area of concern lay just beyond the next ridge, in a natural meadow that would be perfect for grazing if it could be cleared and fenced. Harrison had been considering expanding his cattle operations into this region for months, but the remote location and difficult terrain had made it a low priority. Now, with rumors of unauthorized camping and gathering, the situation required his personal attention. As he crested the ridge, Harrison pulled his horse to a stop and reached for the spyglass he kept in his saddlebags. The meadow spread out below him like a painting, surrounded by towering pines and crossed by a clear stream that caught the morning sunlight. It was beautiful country, the kind of pristine wilderness that existed in fewer and fewer places as civilization pushed westward. Through the spyglass, he could see movement near the stream. At first, he assumed it was deer or elk coming down to drink, but as he adjusted the focus, human figures came into view. A man and a small boy, both moving with the careful deliberation of people who knew the land well. Harrison's first instinct was irritation. These were his lands, and people had no business setting up here without permission. But as he watched, something about the scene began to capture his attention in a way he had not expected. The man was clearly teaching the boy, their movements coordinated in a way that spoke of patience and long practice. The boy carried a small basket while the man knelt beside him, pointing at plants along the stream that Harrison could not identify from his distant vantage point. Harrison found himself studying the pair with growing fascination. The man moved like someone who had been born to this country, reading signs in the earth and wind that remained invisible to Harrison's civilized eyes. His clothing was practical and worn, clearly made for function rather than appearance, and his long dark hair suggested Native American heritage. The boy appeared to be his son, sharing the same dark hair and careful movements, though his smaller size made his attempts to mirror his father's actions somewhat awkward. What struck Harrison most was the quality of attention between them. The man never showed impatience when the boy hesitated, never raised his voice, or showed the kind of frustration that Harrison recognized in himself when dealing with Marcus. Instead, there was a gentle persistence to his teaching, a willingness to repeat instructions and demonstrate techniques until the boy began to understand. Harrison thought of his own son, probably still asleep back at the ranch house, uninterested in learning anything about the business or the land that would someday be his inheritance. When had he last spent this kind of focused time with Marcus, teaching him something that mattered? When had either of them shown this kind of patience with the other? The man below stood up and said something to the boy, then pointed toward a patch of wild berries near the stream. Through the spyglass, Harrison watched as the boy reached carefully to pick them, checking each one as his father had obviously taught him. The boy dropped a few into his basket, proud of his small harvest. Instead of criticism, the man simply nodded and explained something further, his tone calm and encouraging. Harrison found himself leaning forward in his saddle, caught up in the lesson despite himself. The man demonstrated how to test the fruit, how to recognize the plants by leaf and stem, how to move gently so as not to disturb the patch. He spoke quietly, his words lost in the distance, but his body language conveyed encouragement rather than correction. When the boy tried again, his confidence was clear, and Harrison could see the man's approval in the way he placed a hand on his son's shoulder. A memory surfaced unbidden from Harrison's own childhood, his father showing him how to manage the ranch accounts, standing stiff and impatient behind him, while Harrison fumbled with ledgers that seemed impossibly complex to his young mind. "Concentrate, boy," James Blackwood had said. "This is important. You'll need these skills if you're going to run this ranch someday." There had been no praise when Harrison finally balanced the figures, only the expectation that he would do better next time. The contrast was sharp enough to make Harrison shift uncomfortably in his saddle. Below him, the unnamed man was creating exactly the kind of memory that Harrison wished he had with his own father, patient, encouraging, focused entirely on the moment, rather than on future expectations or family legacy. As he continued to watch, Harrison noticed other details that spoke to the man's skill and knowledge. The way he moved through the landscape without disturbing the natural patterns, the careful attention he paid to the growth of plants and the behavior of birds, the obvious familiarity with every rock and tree in the area. This was not some drifter camping illegally on private land, but someone who belonged here in a way that Harrison, despite owning the property on paper, could never claim. The realization should have strengthened his resolve to clear the area of unauthorized activity. Instead, it filled him with something uncomfortably close to envy. How long had it been since he had felt that kind of connection to anything? How many years had passed since he had been able to focus completely on a single task without thinking about profit margins or political implications? Harrison was so absorbed in his observation that he almost missed the moment when everything changed. The boy had been reaching for more berries when a sudden breeze startled a flock of birds from the brush. The commotion startled Harrison's horse as well, causing it to dance sideways and let out a sharp whinny. The sound carried clearly in the still mountain air, and both the man and boy immediately looked up toward his position. Even at this distance, Harrison could see the man's posture change from relaxed instruction to alert caution. The boy moved quickly to his father's side, clearly recognizing the potential for danger. For a long moment, the three of them remained frozen in place, Harrison on the ridge with his spyglass, Samuel and Tommy in the meadow below. Then, with a decision that surprised him even as he made it, Harrison urged his horse forward down the slope toward the stream. He could have simply ridden away, reporting back to Jake that the area was indeed being used by hunters who would need to be moved along. He could have handled the situation through his foreman or the local sheriff, maintaining the distance that his position and wealth usually provided. Instead, he found himself picking his way carefully down the rocky trail, driven by something he could not quite name. As he approached, Harrison could see the man more clearly. He was younger than Harrison had expected, probably in his 30s, with the kind of weathered face that came from years of outdoor living. His dark eyes watched Harrison's approach with careful assessment, ready for trouble but not actively seeking it. The boy stayed close to his father's side, his small bow still in his hands but pointed safely toward the ground. "Good morning," Harrison called when he was still a comfortable distance away, his voice carrying the tone he used for business negotiations, polite but authoritative. The man nodded slowly. "Morning," he replied, his voice carrying a slight accent that Harrison could not quite place. "You're on your land, I expect." The directness of the statement caught Harrison off guard. He had expected evasion or excuses, not this calm acknowledgement of the situation. "I am," he confirmed, dismounting from his horse but keeping the reins in his hand. "Harrison Blackwood. This is part of my ranch." "Samuel Gray Arrow," the man replied, placing a protective hand on his son's shoulder. "This is my boy Tommy. We apologize for the trespass. Mr. Blackwood, we'll pack up and move along." The formal politeness of the response, combined with the obvious regret at having to leave, struck something deep in Harrison's chest. These were not the words of someone trying to take advantage of his property, but of a father who had been sharing something precious with his son and now faced the loss of it. "Wait," Harrison heard himself saying, though he had not consciously decided to speak. "Before you go, could you show me what you were teaching the boy?" Both Samuel and Tommy looked at him with surprise, clearly not having expected this request. Samuel's eyes narrowed slightly, perhaps wondering if this was some kind of trap or test. "You want to know about hunting, Mr. Blackwood?" Samuel asked carefully. "I want to know about teaching," Harrison replied, the words coming from some deeper place than business calculation. "I have a son too. I'm not sure I'm doing it right." The honesty in his voice seemed to reach something in Samuel, who studied Harrison's face for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Teaching requires patience above all things," he said simply, "and respect for what the student can become, not just what he is now." As those words settled between them, Harrison realized that this chance encounter was going to change everything, not just the business decision about land use, but something much more fundamental about the way he understood fatherhood, wealth, and what it truly meant to pass something of value to the next generation. 3 days later, Harrison found himself back at the mountain meadow, this time by arrangement rather than by chance. The ride up the familiar trail felt different now, charged with an anticipation he had not experienced in years. In his saddlebags, he carried not the surveyor's map or legal documents, but a simple lunch and the kind of practical clothing Samuel had suggested for someone learning to move quietly through the wilderness. The ornate pocket, what his father had given him pressed against his ribs with each step of his horse, a reminder of the world he had temporarily left behind. James Blackwood had carried this watch for 40 years, consulting it constantly as if time itself were a resource to be hoarded and spent wisely. "Every minute has a cost, son," he had often said. Successful men know how to account for their time. But up here in the mountains, time seemed to flow differently. The sun marked the hours with the movement of shadows across the meadow, and the only schedule that mattered was the natural rhythm of the animals they hoped to observe and learn from. Samuel was waiting for him near the same spot where they had first met. Tommy at his side with his practice bow. Both of them wore the kind of practical clothing that Harrison was still learning to appreciate. Leather and cloth chosen for durability and silence rather than appearance. Tommy waved shyly when he saw Harrison approaching, the boy's initial wariness having given way to curious friendship. "Good morning, Mr. Blackwood," Samuel called as Harrison dismounted. "Ready for your first real lesson?" "As ready as I can be," Harrison replied, then corrected himself. "Please call me Harrison. Mr. Blackwood feels too formal for what we're doing here." Samuel nodded approvingly. "Harrison it is. And the first thing you need to understand is that everything here has something to teach us, if we know how to listen." Over the next hour, Samuel began Harrison's education in the art of reading the wilderness. They started with tracks in the soft earth near the stream, the delicate hoofprints of deer, the broader pads of a mountain cat, the tiny scratches left by ground birds. Samuel explained how the depth and spacing of the prints could tell a story about the animal's size, speed, and purpose. "See here," Samuel said, kneeling beside a particularly clear set of deer tracks with Tommy and Harrison flanking him. This doe was walking slowly, probably feeding as she moved. But here, he pointed to a section where the tracks were deeper and farther apart, something spooked her. She bounded away in that direction. Harrison found himself fascinated by the level of detail Samuel could extract from what looked like random marks in the dirt. "How can you tell it was a doe and not a buck?" he asked. "Size of the hooves, mostly," Samuel explained patiently. "But also the way she moves. Bucks are more cautious during this time of year, more likely to test the air before committing to a direction. Does with fawns move more directly when they're not alarmed?" Tommy chimed in with the enthusiasm of a good student. "Papa says the tracks tell stories, but you have to know how to read them like words on a page." The comparison made Harrison smile. Marcus was an excellent reader, perhaps too good given his preference for poetry over practical skills, but Harrison doubted his son could read anything useful from the natural world around him. When had Harrison himself lost that ability, if he had ever possessed it? "What story do my tracks tell?" Harrison asked, gesturing back toward the path he had taken from his horse. Samuel and Tommy exchanged a look that might have been amusement. "You want the honest answer?" Samuel asked. "Always. You're learning to walk more quietly, but you're still thinking too much about where to put your feet instead of feeling the ground through them. Your horse is well trained and well cared for, but she's used to easier trails." And Samuel paused, studying Harrison's face for any sign of offense. "You check your watch a lot, even when you're trying not to." Harrison's hand moved instinctively to his vest pocket, then stopped as he realized what he was doing. Samuel's observation was uncomfortably accurate. Even here, surrounded by the timeless rhythms of the wilderness, he found himself thinking about the passage of minutes and the obligations waiting for him back at the ranch. "My father gave me this watch," Harrison said, pulling it out to show them. The gold case was engraved with the Blackwood family crest, and the inscription inside read, "Time is the most precious commodity, J.B. to H.B., 1863. Samuel examined the watch with respectful interest. But it was Tommy who asked the more penetrating question. "Does it make you happy, Mr. Harrison?" The simple directness of the question caught Harrison off guard. "Happy? It's a family heirloom, Tommy. It's valuable. But does it make you happy?" The boy persisted with the relentless logic of childhood. Harrison looked down at the watch in his palm, its steady ticking suddenly seeming loud in the mountain quiet. "I suppose it makes me feel connected to my father," he said slowly. "But no, I don't think it makes me happy." "Then why do you carry it everywhere?" Tommy asked. Before Harrison could formulate an answer, Samuel intervened gently. "Some things we carry because we have to, little wolf, not because we want to. But sometimes we carry them so long, we forget the difference." The observation hit closer to home than Harrison cared to admit. How many aspects of his life had he accepted as necessary when they were actually choices he had made out of habit or expectation? The constant pressure of business, the distance from Marcus, even the way he measured his success against his father's achievements, all of it suddenly seemed less inevitable than he had always assumed. They spent the rest of the morning working on what Samuel called invisible movement, the art of walking through the forest, without disturbing its natural patterns. Harrison's initial attempts were clumsy and loud, his expensive boots announcing his presence with every step. But Samuel's teaching method was nothing like the impatient correction Harrison remembered from his own childhood. "Try feeling the ground before you commit your weight to it," Samuel suggested. "Let your foot test each surface the way a deer would. What if I'm too slow?" Harrison asked, frustrated by his awkward progress. "Speed comes with practice," Samuel replied. "But if you're always rushing, you miss the things that matter." Tommy demonstrated the technique with the unconscious grace of someone who had been learning it since he could walk. His small feet found the quiet places between fallen leaves and unstable stones, allowing him to move through the underbrush almost as silently as the animals they were hoping to observe. Watching the boy's natural ability, Harrison felt a familiar pang of regret. When Marcus had been Tommy's age, Harrison had been too busy building the ranch to spend this kind of time teaching him anything that mattered. By the time Marcus was old enough for serious instruction, the boy had already learned to find his interests elsewhere. "Your son doesn't join you for things like this?" Samuel asked, as if reading Harrison's thoughts. "Marcus is 16, Harrison replied. "He's more interested in books than outdoor skills. Sometimes I think he actively dislikes everything about ranch life." "What does he like?" Tommy asked with genuine curiosity. "Reading, writing. He talks about wanting to travel, to see the world beyond the ranch." Harrison heard the disapproval in his own voice and tried to moderate it. "I suppose there's nothing wrong with those interests, but they won't help him run a cattle operation." Samuel was quiet for a moment, clearly choosing his words carefully. "Maybe the question isn't what will help him run your operation, but what will help him become the man he's meant to be." The simple statement carried more weight than Samuel probably intended. Harrison had spent so many years thinking about molding Marcus into his successor that he had rarely considered what kind of person Marcus might want to become on his own terms. "Did your father teach you the way you're teaching Tommy?" Harrison asked. "Some of it," Samuel replied. "But I also learned from my grandfather and from other elders in our community. No one person can teach everything a child needs to know. What's the most important thing you're trying to teach Tommy?" Samuel considered this question while they watched Tommy practice his stalking technique on a family of rabbits near the stream. The boy moved with increasing confidence, managing to get within 20 feet of the animals before they noticed his presence and bounded away. "Respect," Samuel said finally. "Respect for the land, for the animals, for the knowledge passed down by our ancestors. And respect for his own ability to learn and grow." "That's what I'm trying to do with Marcus," Harrison protested. Are you trying to teach him to respect what you've built, what you think is important?" The distinction was subtle but significant, and Harrison found himself without a ready answer. He had always assumed that teaching Marcus to value the ranch was the same as teaching him to value himself. But Samuel's question suggested otherwise. As the morning progressed, Harrison began to understand that Samuel's teaching method was fundamentally different from anything he had experienced. There was no sense of time pressure, no impatience with mistakes, no comparison to impossible standards. Samuel corrected errors by demonstration rather than criticism, and he celebrated small improvements with genuine enthusiasm. Most importantly, Samuel seemed to trust that Harrison would learn at his own pace and in his own way. There was no sense that failure would result in disappointment or withdrawal of approval, only patient encouragement to try again. By the time they prepared to part ways, Harrison felt both exhausted and energized. His body ached from the unfamiliar effort of moving quietly through rough terrain, but his mind felt clearer than it had in years. The complicated problems of ranch management and family relationships seemed less overwhelming when viewed from the perspective of this mountain meadow. "Same time tomorrow?" Harrison asked as he prepared to mount his horse. "If you'd like," Samuel replied. "But tomorrow we'll work on something different. Reading the wind and weather. It's a skill that might serve you well in your business as much as in hunting." As Harrison rode back toward the ranch, he found himself thinking less about the practical applications of what he was learning and more about the quality of attention Samuel brought to teaching. There was something almost sacred about the way the man shared his knowledge, as if each lesson was a gift rather than an obligation. The pocket watch ticked steadily against his ribs, marking time in its relentless way. But for the first time in years, Harrison felt as if he had spent time rather than merely letting it slip away from him. The leather medicine pouch hung from Samuel's belt like a small repository of ancient wisdom, its worn surface darkened by years of careful handling and mountain weather. Inside, Harrison had learned, were herbs and roots that Samuel's grandmother had taught him to gather, remedies for everything, from infected wounds to winter coughs that had kept their people healthy long before doctors with formal training had ventured into these remote valleys. It was their fifth lesson together, and Harrison had arrived at the meadow carrying supplies he hoped would demonstrate both his gratitude and his growing commitment to this unlikely friendship. In his saddlebags were coffee, sugar, dried beef, and ammunition, practical gifts that he hoped Samuel could use without feeling obligated. "You don't need to bring payment for what I'm teaching you," Samuel said when Harrison began unpacking the supplies, though his tone carried appreciation rather than offense. "It's not payment," Harrison replied. "It's what friends share with each other." The word "friends" hung in the morning air between them, and Harrison realized he had spoken it without conscious thought. When had he last made a new friend? Not a business associate or social acquaintance, but someone whose company he genuinely valued for its own sake. Samuel seemed to consider this distinction, then nodded slowly. "Friends share more than supplies," he said. "They share knowledge, stories, understanding. Then I owe you more than you owe me," Harrison admitted. "What you've been teaching me about reading the land, it's changing how I think about everything." That morning's lesson focused on weather signs, the subtle cues that experienced outdoorsmen used to predict changes in conditions hours or even days before they occurred. Samuel showed Harrison how to read the behavior of birds, the direction and quality of wind, the color and movement of distant clouds. Your cattle business must depend on weather knowledge. Samuel observed as they studied the western horizon, where thin clouds were building against the mountain peaks. To some extent, Harrison agreed. But we have almanacs, reports from the Territorial Weather Service. Modern methods? Tommy looked up from where he had been practicing his knot-tying skills. "But what if the books are wrong, Mr. Harrison? What if the storm comes earlier or later than they say?" It was a child's question, but it carried adult implications that Harrison was only beginning to appreciate. How much had he relied on official sources and expert opinions at the expense of his own observation and judgment? How many decisions had he made based on what he thought he was supposed to know rather than what he could actually see? Samuel demonstrated how to test the wind with a handful of dry grass, reading its direction and strength by watching how the individual blades separated and fell. The old ones used to say that the wind carries messages from all the places it has been. If you know how to listen, it will tell you what's coming. As if to prove his point, the wind shifted subtly, bringing with it the scent of rain from the distant peaks. Samuel breathed deeply, testing the air like a wine connoisseur evaluating a vintage. "Rain tonight," he announced with quiet confidence. "Maybe tomorrow too." The storm is still building strength in the high country. Harrison found himself breathing deeply as well, trying to detect the signs that Samuel read so easily. There was something there, a change in humidity, a different quality to the light, but he lacked the experience to interpret what his senses were telling him. "How did you learn all this?" Harrison asked. "Did your father teach you, like you're teaching Tommy?" Samuel's expression grew thoughtful, perhaps even slightly sad. My father died when I was not much older than Tommy is now. Hunting accident, a wounded bear that we thought was dead. My grandfather and the other elders raised me after that. The casual mention of such a profound loss caught Harrison off guard. He had lost his own father only 2 years ago, but James Blackwood had lived to see his son's success and the continuation of the family business. The thought of losing a father at such a young age, of having to grow up with that kind of responsibility. "I'm sorry," Harrison said, the words feeling inadequate but necessary. "It was a long time ago," Samuel replied. "But it taught me that knowledge needs to be shared while we have the chance. That's why I spend so much time with Tommy. Why I want him to learn not just hunting skills, but the old stories, the proper ways of doing things." "What kind of stories?" Tommy asked, settling into his favorite position for listening, cross-legged on the ground, with his chin propped on his hands. Samuel smiled at his son's eagerness. "Stories about respect, mostly. Like the story of the hunter who took more than he needed and lost the ability to find any game at all. Or the story of the young brave who learned to listen to his grandmother's wisdom instead of thinking he knew everything himself." Harrison found himself drawn into these stories despite their unfamiliar cultural context. They carried truths that transcended their specific origins, lessons about humility, patience, and the consequences of taking more than one gave back. As he listened, he began to understand that Samuel's approach to education was fundamentally different from his own experience. Rather than teaching rules and techniques, Samuel was transmitting a way of thinking about the world and one's place in it. "Do you have stories like that for your son?" Samuel asked when he finished telling Tommy about the hunter who learned to apologize to the spirits of the animals he killed. "Business stories, mostly," Harrison admitted. "Examples of good deals and bad ones. Lessons about managing people and protecting what you've built. Those are important too," Samuel said diplomatically. "But what about stories that teach him who he is, not just what he might do?" The distinction was subtle but profound, and Harrison found himself thinking about the stories his own father had told him. James Blackwood had been full of tales about successful acquisitions, political victories, competitors outwitted and obstacles overcome. But when had he ever told Harrison a story designed to help him understand his own character or values? "I'm not sure I know those kinds of stories," Harrison admitted. "Maybe that's something you need to learn, alongside the hunting skills," Samuel suggested gently. As the morning progressed, Harrison found himself sharing details about his life that he rarely discussed with anyone. He told Samuel about his frustrations with Marcus, his sense that success had somehow isolated him from the things that mattered most. He described the loneliness of making decisions that affected hundreds of people while having no one to really talk to about the weight of that responsibility. Samuel listened with the same careful attention he brought to reading animal tracks, asking occasional questions, but mostly allowing Harrison to work through his thoughts aloud. When Harrison mentioned his concern that Marcus seemed to have no interest in the family legacy, Samuel's response was characteristically thoughtful. "What if the legacy he's meant to carry isn't the one you've prepared for him?" Samuel asked. "What if there's something else he's supposed to do with the advantages you've given him?" "But the ranch, all the work I've put into building it, will it disappear if Marcus chooses a different path? Or will it find another purpose, maybe even a better one?" The questions unsettled Harrison because they challenged assumptions he had never examined. He had always thought of the ranch as something that needed to be preserved, exactly as he had built it, passed down unchanged from generation to generation. But Samuel's perspective suggested that legacy might be more about the values and opportunities you created than about the specific form they took. "Your grandfather who raised you," Harrison said. "Did he expect you to follow exactly the path he had planned?" Samuel chuckled. "He expected me to follow my own path, but with the wisdom he had taught me. He used to say that tradition isn't about doing things the same way forever, but about carrying forward the spirit of what works." As they prepared to part that day, Samuel opened his medicine pouch and removed a small bundle of dried herbs. "For your horse," he explained, noting Harrison's questioning look. "She's been favoring her left front hoof slightly. This will help with inflammation if you mix it with her grain for a few days." Harrison looked down at his mare, surprised that he had not noticed the subtle lameness that Samuel's experienced eye had detected.
"How did you see that?"
"Same way I see everything else," Samuel replied. "By paying attention to what's actually there instead of what I expect to see." On the ride home, Harrison found himself thinking about that distinction. How often did he look at Marcus and see only his expectations, a future rancher, a carrier of family tradition, instead of the actual person his son was becoming? How many signals of distress or unhappiness had he missed because they did not fit his predetermined vision of what their relationship should look like? The storm Samuel had predicted began that evening, with a gentle rain that gradually built into the kind of steady downpour that would soak deep into the earth and provide excellent grazing for the rest of the season. Harrison stood at his study window, watching water cascade from the gutters and listening to the drumming on the roof. Marcus appeared in the doorway, drawn perhaps by the dramatic weather or simply by the unusual sight of his father standing idle in the middle of the day. "Quite a storm," the boy said, joining Harrison at the window. "Samuel predicted it this morning," Harrison replied, then caught himself. He had not intended to mention his mountain lessons to his family. "Samuel?" Marcus asked with genuine curiosity. For a moment, Harrison considered deflecting the question or offering some vague explanation. Instead, he found himself telling his son about the hunting lessons, the tracking skills, the different way of seeing and understanding the natural world that Samuel was teaching him. Marcus listened with more attention than he had shown his father in months, asking questions about the techniques and stories that Samuel shared. When Harrison mentioned the medicine pouch and the herbal remedy for his horse, Marcus's eyes lit up with interest. "Could you ask him about plant medicines for people too?" Marcus asked. "I've been reading about traditional remedies in some of the journals from back east. There's so much knowledge that's being lost as people move to cities." It was the first time in years that Marcus had shown interest in anything connected to the ranch or the frontier life, and Harrison felt a spark of hope that he tried not to let show too obviously. "I could ask him," Harrison replied carefully. "He might be willing to share some of that knowledge." "Maybe I could come with you sometime," Marcus suggested, then seemed to catch himself. "I mean, if you think he wouldn't mind. And if it wouldn't interfere with what you're learning." Harrison looked at his son, really looked at him, trying to see the person rather than the disappointment or the unrealized potential. Marcus was tall for his age, with intelligent eyes and his mother's thoughtful expression. There was nothing weak or unreliable about him. He was simply interested in different things than Harrison had expected. "I think Samuel would enjoy meeting you," Harrison said, "and Tommy would certainly appreciate having another young person to talk to." As they stood together watching the rain, Harrison felt something shift in their relationship, not a dramatic change, but a subtle easing of the tension that had defined their interactions for so long. Perhaps the problem had never been Marcus's lack of interest in the ranch, but Harrison's inability to find ways to connect the boys' actual interests with the opportunities their life provided. The storm continued through the night, and Harrison fell asleep to the sound of rain on the roof, thinking about stories and legacies and the difference between preserving tradition and honoring its spirit. The wooden stakes drove into the earth with sharp, final sounds that seemed to echo across the mountain valley like the first hammers of an unwelcome construction. Harrison discovered them during his morning ride to meet Samuel, following a route that had become as familiar as the paths around his own ranch house. But this morning, the landscape carried new scars, a line of fresh surveyor's marks cutting directly across the meadow where he had been learning to read the ancient language of tracks and weather signs. Each stake bore a small metal tag with numbers and letters that meant nothing to Harrison but everything to the men who had placed them. He dismounted and examined the nearest marker, feeling a cold recognition settle in his stomach. These were the signs of serious intent, the preliminary markings that preceded legal claims and development projects. Samuel was waiting at their usual meeting spot, but his customary calm had been replaced by something harder, more watchful. Tommy sat beside him on a fallen log, his practice bow across his knees. But the boy's usual enthusiasm was dampened by his father's obvious tension. "You've seen them," Samuel said as Harrison approached. "It was not a question just now. Do you know who placed them? Men from town yesterday afternoon. They didn't speak to us, but they made their intentions clear enough." Samuel's voice carried the careful neutrality of someone who had learned to expect disappointment from powerful people. Harrison felt the uncomfortable weight of his own position in this conflict. As one of the largest landowners in the territory, he was naturally aligned with the interests that drove such development projects. The men who had placed these stakes were probably his business associates, members of the same cattlemen's association that Jake Morrison had mentioned during their conversation about clearing unauthorized activity from his northern range. What did they survey? Harrison asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Everything from the creek to the ridge," Samuel replied, gesturing toward the boundaries that encompassed not just their usual meeting place, but the entire area where his family had hunted for generations. "If someone's claiming this land, we'll have to find somewhere else." The simple acceptance in Samuel's voice struck Harrison like a physical blow. Here was a man who had been sharing invaluable knowledge with him, teaching him skills that connected him to the land in ways he had never imagined. And yet Samuel assumed that when it came to a conflict between his rights and the rights of wealthy developers, he would inevitably lose. "It's not that simple," Harrison said, though he was not sure what he meant by that statement. "Isn't it?" Samuel asked quietly. "Men with money want the land. We don't have money. We move on." Tommy looked up at his father with the kind of trust that assumed adults could fix problems that seemed insurmountable to children. "But Papa, where will we go? This is our place." Samuel's hand moved to rest on his son's shoulder with the gentle authority Harrison had come to recognize as one of his most admirable qualities. "There are other places, little wolf. We've moved before, but you shouldn't have to move," Harrison said, surprising himself with the intensity of his reaction. "Your family has been hunting here longer than anyone can remember." "Long enough doesn't matter if it's not legal enough," Samuel replied with the weary wisdom of someone who had learned hard lessons about the way power actually worked in the world. Harrison studied the surveyor's stakes, trying to understand what they represented beyond the obvious threat to his friendship with Samuel. Someone with significant resources had invested in having this land professionally surveyed, which meant they had specific plans and probably legal backing for whatever development they envisioned. "Do you know who's behind this?" Harrison asked. Samuel shook his head. "The surveyors didn't say, and we didn't ask. Sometimes it's better not to know the names of people who have already decided you don't matter." The casual acceptance of powerlessness in Samuel's voice bothered Harrison more than any direct accusation could have. Here was a man whose knowledge of the land surpassed that of any university-trained expert, whose skills could keep a family alive in conditions that would kill most civilized people. And yet he assumed that his voice would carry no weight against the forces that had marked his hunting grounds for development. "What if I made some inquiries?" Harrison offered. "I have connections in the business community. Maybe I could find out what's being planned, see if there are alternatives." Samuel looked at him with something that might have been surprise or might have been skepticism. "Why would you do that?" "You barely know us." The question forced Harrison to examine his own motivations, which were more complex than he had realized. Partly, he was motivated by friendship and gratitude for what Samuel had taught him. But partly, he was driven by a growing recognition that the kind of development these stakes represented would destroy something irreplaceable. Not just Samuel's hunting grounds, but a way of understanding the land that was becoming rarer with each passing year. Because what you've shown me here has value, Harrison said slowly. Not just to you and Tommy, but to anyone who wants to understand what this country really is beneath all the legal documents and property lines. Tommy brightened at this declaration of support, but Samuel remained cautious. Powerful men don't usually change their plans because someone like me asks them to. They might listen to someone like me, Harrison replied, then immediately wondered if that was true. His influence was significant within his own sphere, but it had limits, especially if he found himself opposing the interests of his peers. As they continued their conversation, Harrison learned more about Samuel's history with the land than he had discovered in all their previous meetings. The Grey Arrow family had been hunting in these mountains since before the first wagon trains crossed the territory, maintaining a seasonal camp here for generations. Samuel's grandfather had signed agreements with early settlers that were supposed to protect their traditional hunting rights. But those documents had been lost or ignored as legal systems changed and power shifted to newer arrivals. My grandfather used to say that the land doesn't belong to anyone, Samuel explained as they walked among the surveyor's stakes. But people can belong to the land if they understand their proper place in it. The distinction was more than philosophical. It represented a fundamental difference in worldview that Harrison was only beginning to appreciate. He had always thought in terms of ownership, control, and the right to exclude others from property he had purchased or inherited. Samuel's perspective suggested a more complex relationship based on stewardship, respect, and the understanding that the land would outlast any individual's claim to it. If you lose access to this area, Harrison asked, what happens to all the knowledge you've been sharing with me? The tracking skills, the weather reading, the understanding of animal behavior? Some of it can be learned other places, Samuel replied, but some of it is specific to this valley, this ecosystem. Once we're gone, that knowledge goes with us. Harrison found this thought deeply troubling. In his business world, valuable knowledge was documented, preserved, and passed down through institutional memory. But the kind of wisdom Samuel possessed existed only in the minds and hands of people who had lived it. And once those people were displaced or died, entire libraries of understanding disappeared forever. That afternoon, Harrison rode directly to town instead of returning to his ranch. The territorial capital was growing rapidly, transforming from a frontier settlement into something that resembled the eastern cities where Marcus dreamed of living. New buildings rose alongside the old, and the streets bustled with the kind of commercial energy that usually excited Harrison, but today filled him with unease. The office of the territorial surveyor occupied the second floor of a new brick building that announced its importance through impressive architecture and expensive furnishings. Harrison's name and reputation gained him immediate access to the chief surveyor, a competent man named Patterson who had handled several projects for Harrison's associates. Mr. Blackwood, Patterson said warmly, gesturing toward a leather chair that probably cost more than most people earned in a month. What brings you to town? Planning some development projects of your own? Actually, I wanted to ask about a survey that was conducted yesterday in the northern mountains, Harrison replied, accepting the offered seat. Near Miller's Creek, in the High Valley. Patterson consulted a large ledger book, running his finger down columns of entries until he found what he was looking for. Ah, yes, the Consolidated Development Project. Quite ambitious, actually. Someone's planning a significant investment in that area. Consolidated Development? Harrison asked, not recognizing the name. New company, formed by a consortium of established businessmen. They're looking at mining possibilities, maybe some timber operations. The survey was preliminary, just to establish boundaries and assess the terrain. Harrison felt his stomach tighten. Mining and timber operations would completely transform the valley, making it impossible for Samuel's family to continue their traditional use of the land. More than that, such development would destroy the delicate ecosystem that supported the wildlife Samuel had been teaching him to understand and appreciate. Who's behind Consolidated Development? Harrison asked as casually as he could manage. Patterson hesitated slightly, perhaps recognizing that he was venturing into sensitive territory. Well, it's a matter of public record once the incorporation papers are filed. Mostly cattlemen looking to diversify their investments. Your friend Morrison is involved, I believe. And several others from the Cattlemen's Association. The revelation hit Harrison like cold water. Jake Morrison, his own foreman, was part of the consortium planning to develop Samuel's hunting grounds. The same Jake Morrison who had advised him to clear unauthorized activity from his northern range, who had spoken dismissively of people who could not prove their legal claims to land they had used for generations. Is this connected to my holdings in any way? Harrison asked carefully. Not directly, though I believe some of the access roads would cross your property. Nothing that couldn't be worked out between business partners, of course. Harrison left the surveyor's office with his mind racing. The development of Samuel's hunting grounds was not some distant corporate decision made by strangers. It was a project involving people he worked with, people who probably assumed he would support their plans without question. His opposition to the project would not be seen as a neutral business decision, but as a betrayal of his own social and economic class. As he rode home through the gathering dusk, Harrison found himself thinking about loyalty and obligation in ways that had never occurred to him before. He had always assumed that his primary loyalty was to his family, his business interests, and his peers in the ranching community. But his friendship with Samuel had created new obligations, new ways of thinking about what it meant to be a good neighbor and a responsible steward of the land. The choice he faced was not just about protecting Samuel's hunting grounds. It was about deciding what kind of man he wanted to be, what kind of legacy he wanted to leave beyond the accumulation of wealth and property. For the first time in his adult life, Harrison found himself questioning whether the interests of his social class were automatically aligned with his own deepest values. The surveyor's stakes stood in the mountain meadow like grave markers for a way of life that was about to end. But perhaps, Harrison thought as he approached his ranch house, they did not have to be final. Perhaps there were other ways to think about development and progress that did not require the complete destruction of everything that had come before. The eagle feather lay across Tommy's small palm like a piece of captured sky, its dark brown surface marked with the subtle patterns that only came from a bird that had soared above the highest peaks. Samuel's father had given him a similar feather when he was Tommy's age, and his grandfather before that, a tradition that stretched back through generations of hunters who understood that some gifts carried more than material value. This belonged to my grandfather, Samuel explained as he carefully transferred the feather to Tommy's hands. He said it would help me remember that there are always higher perspectives even when things seem difficult. They were sitting in their favorite spot beside the stream, but the mood was different today. 3 weeks had passed since the discovery of the surveyor's stakes, and despite Harrison's promises to investigate the situation, the wooden markers remained in place like silent sentries, announcing the countdown to change. Harrison had been meeting with them regularly throughout this period, and Tommy had grown genuinely fond of the wealthy rancher who listened to his father's teachings with such careful attention. But today, Harrison carried news that would test all of their friendships and assumptions about loyalty. I found out who's behind the development project, Harrison said without preamble as he approached their camp. It's complicated. Samuel looked up from the small fire where he had been preparing coffee in a battered tin pot, reading something in Harrison's expression that suggested more trouble than they had anticipated. Tommy continued examining his grandfather's feather, but his posture showed he was listening to every word. How complicated? Samuel asked. My foreman, Jake Morrison, is one of the investors, along with several other men from the Cattlemen's Association. Harrison paused, clearly struggling with how much to reveal. They formed a company called Consolidated Development. They're planning mining operations, possibly timber harvesting. The words settled over their small camp, like the shadow of a passing storm cloud. Samuel had experienced enough broken promises and betrayed trusts to understand immediately what this meant. not just for his family's access to their traditional hunting grounds, but for Harrison's ability to help them even if he wanted to. "Men you work with," Samuel said, his voice carefully neutral. "Men I've worked with for years," Harrison confirmed. "Men who assume I'll support their business ventures without question." Tommy looked up from his feather, his young mind processing the implications with the clarity that sometimes comes to children when adults are trying to soften difficult truths. "Does that mean you can't help us anymore, Mr. Harrison?" The direct question cut through all the diplomatic language and political considerations that had been occupying Harrison's thoughts for weeks. Here was an 8-year-old boy asking whether their friendship was strong enough to survive conflicting loyalties and economic pressures. "I don't know," Harrison answered honestly, "but I'm going to try." Over the next hour, as they shared coffee and the simple meal Samuel had prepared, Harrison explained what he had learned about the development project. Consolidated Development had significant financial backing and political support. The territorial governor had already expressed enthusiasm for projects that would bring more industry to the region, and the local newspaper had run editorials praising the vision of businessmen who were willing to invest in the area's economic future. "They're not just planning to use the land," Harrison explained. "They want to fundamentally change it, strip mining for copper and silver, clear-cutting the timber, probably building a railroad spur to transport materials to market." Samuel listened to these plans with the stoic acceptance of someone who had always known that this day would eventually come. But Tommy's reaction was more emotional, his hands clutching the eagle feather as if it could somehow protect everything he was about to lose. "What about the deer?" Tommy asked. "What about all the animals that live here?" "They'll have to find somewhere else," Harrison replied, hating the inadequacy of his answer. "But where?" Tommy persisted. "You said this was special land, that not many places had everything they needed." Harrison looked at Samuel for help answering this question, but found no assistance there. Samuel's expression suggested that he had already worked through these implications and accepted the painful truth that displacement of his family would mean the end of a way of life that had sustained them for generations. "Maybe we should show you something," Samuel said finally, rising from his seat beside the fire. "Something I probably should have shown you weeks ago." He led them deeper into the valley than they had ever gone before, following a faint trail that wound between granite boulders and stands of ancient pine. After about a mile of walking, they emerged into a small clearing where the evidence of long human habitation was unmistakable. Fire rings blackened by countless seasons of use, food storage pits carefully lined with stones, and shelter sites positioned to take advantage of natural windbreaks and water sources. "This is our family's winter camp," Samuel explained as they explored the clearing. "We've used this place for more than 100 years. My great-grandfather is buried on that ridge, and his father beside him." Harrison walked among the remnants of this seasonal community with growing amazement. The camp showed a level of environmental integration that his own ranch operations could not match. Structures that worked with the natural landscape rather than imposing artificial patterns on it. Resource management systems that could sustain a family through harsh winters without depleting the ecosystem that supported them. "How many people know about this place?" Harrison asked. "Very few outside our family," Samuel replied. "We've always been careful to keep it hidden from people who might not understand its importance." The trust implied by this revelation was not lost on Harrison. Samuel was sharing something sacred with him, something that could be used against his family if it fell into the wrong hands. The winter camp represented not just seasonal shelter, but a continuous connection to this landscape that stretched back through generations of careful stewardship. Tommy had wandered to the edge of the clearing where a small shrine had been constructed from carefully arranged stones and weathered pieces of wood. "Tell Mr. Harrison about great-great-grandfather," he said to his father. Samuel joined them at the shrine, his voice taking on the cadence of someone sharing a story that had been told many times but never lost its power to move him. Tommy's great-great-grandfather was the one who first made agreements with the white settlers who came through this valley. He believed that people could share the land if they respected each other's needs and ways of using it. What happened to those agreements? Harrison asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. They worked for a while, Samuel replied. But as more settlers came, and as the government systems changed, the new people stopped honoring the old agreements. They said if we couldn't prove our ownership with the right kind of papers, we had no legitimate claim to be here. Harrison found himself thinking about the legal framework that governed property rights in the territory, systems designed by and for people who understood land as a commodity to be bought and sold rather than as a living system that supported communities across generations. From that perspective, Samuel's family's connection to this place was indeed unprovable and therefore irrelevant. But standing in the clearing where Tommy's ancestors had lived and died and passed down their knowledge, Harrison began to understand that legal frameworks could be wrong, that some forms of ownership were deeper and more legitimate than what could be documented in territorial land offices. If the mining project goes through, he said slowly, all of this will be destroyed. All of it, Samuel confirmed. Not just the camp, but the whole ecosystem that makes it possible. The stream will be polluted, the wildlife driven away, the plants we depend on poisoned by mining chemicals. Tommy had been listening to this conversation with the focused attention of a child trying to understand adult problems that would determine his future. Now he looked up at Harrison with the kind of direct question that adults often spend years avoiding. Are you going to let them do it, Mr. Harrison? Are you going to let them wreck our home? The question hung in the mountain air like a challenge that could not be deflected or diplomatically avoided. Tommy was not asking about business considerations or political realities. He was asking about friendship, loyalty, and the courage to stand up for what was right, even when it was difficult. I'm going to try to stop them, Harrison heard himself saying, though he had not consciously made that decision until the words were out of his mouth. The commitment felt both terrifying and liberating. Terrifying because it would put him in direct conflict with his business associates and possibly threaten his own economic interests. Liberating because it finally aligned his actions with values he had been rediscovering through his friendship with Samuel and Tommy. You understand what that might cost you? Samuel asked quietly. I'm beginning to, Harrison replied. But I think I'm also beginning to understand what it would cost me not to try. As they walked back toward their usual meeting place, Harrison found himself thinking about legacy in ways that transcended the simple accumulation and preservation of wealth. His father had built the Blackwood Empire through shrewd business decisions and the careful cultivation of powerful alliances. But what kind of legacy would Harrison leave if he allowed those same alliances to destroy something as irreplaceable as Samuel's family connection to this land? That evening, as Harrison rode home through the gathering dusk, he carried with him not just the memory of Tommy's trust and Samuel's quiet dignity, but also the eagle feather that Tommy had insisted he take. So you don't forget there are always higher perspectives, the boy had said, pressing the feather into Harrison's reluctant hands. Now, as Harrison contemplated the conflict ahead, he understood that Tommy's gift represented more than just a token of friendship. It was a reminder that some things were worth fighting for, even when the odds seemed impossible. That some forms of wealth could not be measured in dollars or acres, and that true leadership sometimes required the courage to stand against your own interests in service of larger principles. The surveyor's stakes still marked their claim on Samuel's hunting grounds, but Harrison no longer saw them as inevitable markers of progress. Instead, they had become symbols of a choice he had to make, between the comfortable certainty of his established social position and the harder path of defending something he had learned to value more than money or status. The eagle feather rested in his vest pocket beside his father's gold watch. Two different kinds of inheritance that represented two very different ways of understanding what it meant to be a man of substance in a changing world. The land deed, Document was yellowed with age and brittle at the edges, but the ink remained clear enough to read, despite the decades that had passed since its creation. Harrison held it carefully in the lamplight of Samuel's simple cabin. Squinting at the formal legal language that had been penned in careful script by some long-dead territorial clerk, he had come to the mountains this morning intending to warn Samuel about the acceleration of the Consolidated Development Project. Jake Morrison had informed him that surveying would be completed within the week, and actual mining operations could begin before winter. Instead, he found himself staring at a document that changed everything he thought he knew about the conflict over Samuel's hunting grounds. "Where did you get this?" Harrison asked, his voice tight with the implications of what he was reading. "My grandfather kept it in a special pouch," Samuel replied, watching Harrison's reaction carefully. "Along with other papers from the old days. I never paid much attention to them until you started asking questions about legal ownership." Tommy sat cross-legged on the cabin floor, sorting through other documents from his great-grandfather's collection, letters from territorial officials, receipts for supplies purchased in town, even a faded photograph of Samuel's grandfather standing beside white officials in formal poses that suggested important negotiations. But it was the land deed that commanded Harrison's full attention. The document, dated 1847 and bearing the official seal of the territorial government, granted Samuel Iron Crow and his descendants in perpetuity hunting and seasonal residence rights to the valley systems surrounding Miller's Creek, extending from the natural stone bridge to the high meadows below Eagle Peak. The description matched Samuel's traditional hunting grounds perfectly, and the legal language was unambiguous. This was not some informal agreement or verbal understanding that could be dismissed by modern courts. It was a formal treaty, properly witnessed and recorded, that granted Samuel's family legal rights to the disputed land. "Do you understand what this means?" Harrison asked, his mind racing through the implications. "I understand it's a piece of paper that powerful men will say doesn't matter anymore." Samuel replied with the weary pragmatism of someone who had learned not to trust legal systems that could be reinterpreted whenever convenient for people with money and influence. "No," Harrison said firmly. "This is a binding legal document. If it's authentic, and it appears to be, then your family has legitimate claim to this land that predates any mining rights Consolidated Development might think they've acquired." Samuel looked skeptical. "You think white men's courts will honor agreements made with Indians 50 years ago?" The question forced Harrison to confront uncomfortable truths about the legal system he had always assumed would protect legitimate property rights. Samuel was right to be skeptical. Territorial courts had a long history of finding reasons to invalidate Native American land claims, regardless of the legal strength of the documentation. But Harrison also knew something that Samuel did not. The current territorial judge was a man named Henry Thornton, a former law school classmate of Harrison's, who prided himself on legal precedent and constitutional principles. If the case could be presented properly, with competent legal representation and evidence of the document's authenticity, Thornton might be willing to uphold the original treaty. "It's not going to be easy," Harrison admitted. "But this document gives us a legal basis to challenge the mining project. If we can prove your family's prior claim, Consolidated Development won't be able to proceed." "Us?" Samuel asked quietly. The pronoun had slipped out without conscious thought, but Harrison realized he meant it completely. This was no longer about helping a friend with a property dispute. It was about standing up for principles that transcended business interests and social loyalties. "I'm going to help you." "Fight this," Harrison said. "Whatever it takes." Tommy looked up from the old photographs he had been examining. "Does this mean we won't have to leave, Papa?" "Maybe, little wolf," Samuel replied cautiously. "But it also means we might be in for a difficult time. Some people won't be happy about us standing up for our rights." The understatement carried more weight than its simple words suggested. Harrison was beginning to understand that his decision to support Samuel's legal claim would be seen as betrayal by his business associates, potential financial suicide by his peers, and incomprehensible disloyalty by men like Jake Morrison, who viewed territorial development as inevitable and necessary progress. Over the next several hours, Harrison and Samuel worked through the implications of the land deed and developed a strategy for presenting Samuel's case to the territorial court. Harrison would hire the best legal representation available, using his own resources and connections to ensure that Samuel's claim received proper consideration. Samuel would gather additional evidence of his family's continuous use of the land, witnesses who could testify to the winter camps, documentation of seasonal hunting patterns, anything that would support the legitimacy of the original treaty. But even as they planned their legal strategy, Harrison found himself thinking about the broader conflict this case would create. Jake Morrison was not just an employee. He was a friend and trusted advisor who had helped build the Blackwood Ranch into its current success. The other members of Consolidated Development were men Harrison had worked with for years, men who had supported his political interests and included him in profitable business ventures. His opposition to their mining project would not be seen as a neutral legal matter, but as personal betrayal that could destroy relationships and business partnerships that had taken decades to build. More than that, it would mark him as the kind of man who put sentiment and friendship above practical business interests, a reputation that could undermine his effectiveness in future negotiations and ventures. "You don't have to do this," Samuel said, as they finished reviewing the documents. "You've already taught me more about your world than I ever expected to learn." "That's enough." "No, it's not enough," Harrison replied. "This isn't just about you anymore, or even about this land. It's about what kind of community we're building here, what kind of place we're leaving for our children." As if summoned by the mention of children, Marcus appeared in the cabin doorway, having ridden up the mountain trail that Harrison had described to him weeks earlier. The young man looked around the simple interior with obvious interest, taking in the practical furnishings and the evidence of a life lived close to the natural world. "Father," Marcus said uncertainly, "Jake Morrison said you might be here. Mother was worried when you didn't return for dinner." Harrison realized with a start that he had been so absorbed in the implications of Samuel's land deed that he had completely lost track of time. The sun was setting outside the cabin windows, and he had promised Eleanor he would be home by evening. "Marcus, I'd like you to meet Samuel Gray Arrow and his son Tommy," Harrison said, making the introductions he had been planning for weeks. "Samuel, this is my son Marcus." The young men studied each other with the cautious interest of people who had heard descriptions but were meeting for the first time. Marcus was clearly intrigued by Tommy's easy confidence and the evidence of outdoor skills that he had never developed himself. Tommy seemed fascinated by Marcus's formal education and his tales of life in eastern cities. "Father's told me about the hunting lessons you've been giving him," Marcus said to Samuel. "And about the plant medicines you know about. I've been reading about traditional remedies in some medical journals." Samuel's eyes lit up with interest. "What kind of medicines have you been reading about?" As the two began discussing herbal treatments and traditional healing practices, Harrison found himself watching an interaction he had not expected. Marcus was engaging with Samuel's knowledge not as exotic curiosities, but as legitimate areas of study that connected to his own intellectual interests. For the first time, Harrison could see a way that his son's scholarly inclinations might complement rather than conflict with the practical realities of frontier life. But their family reunion was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching the cabin at a rapid pace. Through the windows, Harrison could see torches and the shapes of multiple riders, more people than would come visiting at this hour unless something was seriously wrong. "Expecting company?" Harrison asked Samuel, though the tense set of the other man's shoulders suggested he was not. "No," Samuel replied, moving toward the rifle that rested beside the door. "And people who come after dark with torches usually aren't bringing good news." The riders stopped just outside the circle of light cast by the cabin windows. Harrison could see at least 6 men, all heavily armed, and he recognized several of them as employees of various ranching operations. At the front of the group, clearly in command, sat Jake Morrison. "Mr. Blackwood," Jake called out in a voice that carried across the clearing. "We need to talk." "You too, Indian. Step outside where we can see you." The formal tone and the obvious threat behind it made Harrison's decision clear. Whatever Jake Morrison and his companions wanted to discuss, it was connected to the land rights issue and Harrison's growing support for Samuel's legal claim. "Stay inside," Harrison told Marcus and Tommy quietly. "Whatever happens, don't come outside unless we call for you." Samuel checked his rifle and moved to stand beside Harrison at the door. "You sure you want to be part of this?" he asked quietly. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," Harrison replied, and realized he meant it completely. As they stepped outside to face Jake Morrison and his riders, Harrison understood that this confrontation would determine more than just the fate of Samuel's hunting grounds. It would decide what kind of man he was going to be, what kind of legacy he was going to leave, and whether his friendship with Samuel was strong, enough to survive the kind of pressure that powerful men could bring to bear when their interests were threatened. The land deed in his pocket felt like both a weapon and a shield as he walked forward to meet whatever Jake Morrison and Consolidated Development had decided to do about his betrayal of their interests. The Winchester rifle rested across Harrison's knees as he sat on the porch of Samuel's cabin, its familiar weight both reassuring and symbolic of how dramatically his life had changed in the past month. He had owned this rifle for 15 years, using it primarily for hunting deer on his own property and the occasional coyote that threatened his cattle. Now it represented his willingness to fight for something more important than business interests or social standing. The confrontation with Jake Morrison and his riders 3 nights earlier had ended without violence, but the lines had been drawn with unmistakable clarity. Morrison had come to deliver a message from Consolidated Development: withdraw support for Samuel's legal claim, or face the consequences of opposing the combined interests of the territory's most powerful ranchers. "You're making a mistake, Harrison," Morrison had said, his voice carrying the disappointed tone of someone who had expected better from a business partner. "This Indian's got some old papers that don't mean anything in the modern world. You're risking everything you've built for people who don't even understand property rights." Harrison's response had been simple and direct. "I understand property rights perfectly, Jake. That's why I'm supporting Samuel's legal claim." The conversation that followed had been illuminating in ways Harrison had not expected. Morrison and the other riders had revealed the full scope of Consolidated Development's plans for the valley. Not just mining operations, but a comprehensive transformation that would include lumber mills, a company town, and transportation infrastructure that would fundamentally alter the character of the entire region. More troubling was Morrison's casual assumption that Harrison's opposition could be overcome through economic pressure and social isolation. "You can't run a ranch operation without cooperation from the community, Harrison. Think about what you're risking for some romantic notion about Indian rights." But Harrison had already thought about it extensively and honestly. His decision to support Samuel's claim would indeed carry costs, some financial, some social, some personal. Jake Morrison would resign his position as foreman, taking with him years of experience and established relationships with other ranchers. Several business partnerships would likely be dissolved, and Harrison's standing in the Cattlemen's Association would be permanently damaged. The question was whether those costs were acceptable when measured against what would be gained, or more accurately, what would be preserved. Samuel's family connection to the land, the ecosystem that supported traditional hunting practices, and perhaps most importantly, the principle that legal agreements should be honored regardless of the political convenience of doing so. Now, as Harrison sat guard outside Samuel's cabin while the final legal documents were prepared, he found himself thinking about courage and its various forms. Physical courage was what people usually thought of when they used the word. the willingness to face bodily danger in defense of something important. But there was also moral courage, the willingness to do what was right, even when it cost you the approval of people whose opinions you had always valued. Samuel emerged from the cabin carrying 2 cups of coffee, settling into the chair beside Harrison with the easy movement of someone who had spent his life in the outdoors. The friendship between them had deepened during the crisis in ways that transcended their original teacher-student relationship. They were now allies in a cause that mattered to both of them, though for different reasons. "Tommy's finally asleep," Samuel reported. "All this excitement has been hard on him. He wants to help, but he doesn't understand why grown men would come with guns to settle a legal dispute." "I'm not sure I understand it myself," Harrison admitted. "In my business dealings, we've always solved disagreements through negotiation or courts. This feels different." "It is different," Samuel replied quietly. "This isn't about business. It's about power and who gets to decide how the land is used. Some men don't want to risk letting courts make decisions they might not like." The distinction was important, and Harrison was beginning to appreciate its implications. Consolidated Development's aggressive tactics suggested they were not confident that their legal position would prevail in a fair hearing. Their pressure on Harrison to withdraw his support indicated they understood that his resources and social standing gave Samuel's case credibility it would not otherwise possess. "Any word from the lawyer?" Harrison asked. "Marcus rode back to town this afternoon to check with him," Samuel replied. "Should be back soon with news about the hearing date." The involvement of Harrison's son in their legal preparations had been an unexpected development that pleased Harrison more than he could have anticipated. Marcus had thrown himself into researching territorial law and precedent with the same scholarly energy he usually devoted to literature and philosophy. More importantly, he had done so without being asked, recognizing that his father was fighting for something that mattered and wanting to contribute to the effort. "How do you think Marcus is handling all this?" Harrison asked. Samuel considered the question carefully. "He's proud of you," he said finally. Maybe for the first time in years, he's seeing his father stand up for something bigger than business success. The observation struck Harrison as both accurate and painful. He had spent so many years trying to teach Marcus about responsibility and legacy, but perhaps the most important lesson he could offer was this demonstration that some principles were worth defending, even when it was costly to do so. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of approaching horses announced Marcus's return from town. But instead of the single rider they expected, multiple horses were approaching at a rapid pace that suggested urgency or trouble. Harrison and Samuel both rose, weapons ready, until they could identify the riders in the darkness. Marcus was indeed among them, but he was accompanied by Judge Henry Thornton and 2 territorial marshals. An official presence that could mean either very good news or very bad news for their cause. "Father," Marcus called as they approached the cabin. Judge Thornton insisted on coming himself. "There's been a development." The judge dismounted with the careful movements of someone who spent most of his time behind a desk rather than on horseback. Harrison had known Henry Thornton for 20 years and had always respected his commitment to legal precedent over political convenience. But Thornton's presence at Samuel's cabin, accompanied by territorial marshals, suggested complications that Harrison had not anticipated. "Harrison," Judge Thornton said formally, extending his hand. "Mr. Grey Arrow, I apologize for the late hour, but circumstances require immediate attention." "What kind of circumstances?" Harrison asked, though he suspected the answer would not be good news. "Consolidated Development has filed an emergency injunction claiming that your client has made threats against their survey crews," Thornton explained, his tone suggesting skepticism about the claims. "They're requesting immediate removal of all unauthorized persons from the disputed property." Samuel's expression hardened. "We haven't threatened anyone, Judge. We've been careful to avoid any confrontation while the legal process moves forward." "I suspected as much," Thornton replied. but the allegations are serious enough that I felt obligated to investigate personally, rather than simply issuing orders from my chambers. One of the territorial marshals, a competent-looking man in his 40s, stepped forward. "We've already spoken with the survey crew that filed the complaint, Your Honor. Their story doesn't hold together well under questioning." Harrison felt a surge of relief, mixed with anger. "Are you saying they've made false accusations?" "I'm saying their account of events changes, depending on which questions we ask," the marshal replied diplomatically. "But it's created enough legal confusion that we need to sort things out before the scheduled hearing." Judge Thornton gestured toward the cabin porch. "May we sit down? There are several issues we need to discuss, and I'd prefer to handle them informally if possible." As they settled into chairs and makeshift seats around the porch, Harrison found himself studying the judge's demeanor for clues about his intentions. Thornton had always been fair in his business dealings, but this situation involved political pressures and economic interests that could influence even the most principled officials. "First," Thornton began, "I want you to know that I've had the land deed document examined by experts. It appears to be authentic, properly witnessed, and legally binding under territorial law as it existed in 1847. Samuel's relief was visible, though he tried to maintain his usual stoic expression. Tommy appeared in the cabin doorway, drawn by the voices and the unusual late-night activity. However, the judge continued, Consolidated Development is arguing that subsequent territorial legislation has invalidated such agreements, particularly those involving Native American land rights. On what legal basis? Marcus asked, his scholarly interest in the case evident in his detailed knowledge of the relevant statutes. "They're citing the Territorial Development Act of 1863, Thornton replied. "It's a weak argument, but it could complicate the proceedings and delay resolution for months or even years." Harrison understood the implications immediately. Consolidated Development was using the legal system not to prove their case, but to create enough uncertainty and delay that Samuel's family would be forced to abandon their claims simply because they lacked the resources to sustain a prolonged legal battle. What would it take to resolve this quickly? Harrison asked. Ideally, an unambiguous demonstration that Mr. Gray Arrow's family has maintained continuous, documented use of the land for the entire period since the original treaty was signed, Thornton replied. Something that would make the 1863 legislation irrelevant. Samuel and Harrison exchanged glances. They had been gathering evidence of the family's seasonal use of the hunting grounds, but most of it was based on oral tradition and physical evidence that might not carry weight in a formal legal proceeding. "What about the winter camp?" Tommy asked quietly from the doorway. "Would that count as documented use?" Judge Thornton looked at the boy with interest. "What winter camp, son?" Samuel made a decision that Harrison could see forming in his expression. "We haven't shown this to anyone outside our family," he said slowly. "But there's a seasonal camp about 2 miles from here that we've maintained continuously since before the original treaty." "Maintained how?" Thornton asked. "Seasonal occupancy, food storage, burial sites," Samuel replied. "My great-grandfather is buried there, along with other family members. The camp structures are rebuilt every few years, but always in the same locations using traditional methods." The judge leaned forward with obvious interest. "Would you be willing to show me this camp? If it demonstrates continuous use as you describe, it could provide exactly the legal foundation we need to uphold your claim." "It's sacred ground," Samuel said carefully. "But if it will help protect our legal rights, I'm willing to make an exception." Harrison found himself thinking about trust and the various forms it could take. Samuel was offering to share something precious and private with strangers, risking the desecration of family burial sites in hopes of protecting his family's future access to their traditional hunting grounds. "There's another issue," Judge Thornton continued. "Consolidated Development has hired some additional security personnel, men with questionable reputations and a history of using intimidation tactics. My marshals have been keeping an eye on the situation, but if this case goes to trial, All parties need to understand that any form of harassment or threats will result in criminal charges. The warning was clearly directed toward both sides, but Harrison understood its primary target. Morrison and his associates were escalating their pressure tactics, perhaps hoping to provoke some kind of confrontation that would discredit Samuel's legal case. "We've been careful to avoid any provocative actions," Harrison assured the judge. "I know you have," Thornton replied. "But situations like this have a way of getting out of hand quickly, especially when large amounts of money are involved." As the evening progressed, they developed a plan for the legal proceedings that would begin in earnest the following week. Judge Thornton would visit Samuel's winter camp to examine the evidence of continuous occupancy. Harrison's lawyer would present the historical documentation and legal precedent supporting Samuel's claim. Marcus would assist with research and organization of evidence, but beneath the legal maneuvering, Harrison sensed that the real battle would be fought through intimidation, economic pressure, and the kind of political influence that operated outside the formal judicial system. Consolidated Development had too much invested in their mining project to accept defeat gracefully, and men like Jake Morrison were not accustomed to being told that their business plans had to accommodate the rights of people they considered obstacles to progress. "One more thing," Judge Thornton said as he prepared to leave. "Harrison, you should know that your support for this case has attracted attention from territorial officials. Some of them are pleased to see a prominent rancher standing up for legal principle over business convenience. Others see you as a troublemaker who's forgotten his proper place in the community. Which group do you belong to?" Harrison asked directly. Thornton smiled for the first time that evening. "I belong to the group that believes legal documents mean what they say, regardless of whether that's convenient for developers or politicians." As the judge and his marshals rode away into the darkness, Harrison found himself alone with Samuel, Marcus, and Tommy, a makeshift family bound together by shared commitment to something larger than their individual interests. "Tomorrow we start the real fight," Samuel said quietly. "No," Harrison corrected. "Tomorrow we finish what we started weeks ago, when I decided your friendship was worth more than Jake Morrison's approval." The Winchester rifle remained across his lap, but Harrison no longer thought of it primarily as a weapon. Instead, it had become a symbol of his willingness to defend something precious, not just Samuel's legal rights, but the principle that some forms of wealth could not be measured in dollars, and some forms of progress came at too high a cost to accept. The tomahawk felt alien in Harrison's hands, despite Samuel's patient instruction in its proper use and balance. Unlike the rifles and pistols he had carried for hunting and protection, this weapon required a different kind of skill, one that brought him closer to his target rather than maintaining the comfortable distance that firearms provided. "It's not just a weapon," Samuel explained as they stood in the pre-dawn darkness outside his cabin. "It's a tool for building, for cutting wood, for survival. But when you need it to protect what matters, it will serve that purpose too." The courthouse hearing had been scheduled for 10 o'clock that morning, but neither man harbored any illusions that their legal victory would end the conflict with Consolidated Development. Jake Morrison's hired men had been making increasingly bold appearances around Samuel's hunting grounds, and the message was clear. Regardless of what Judge Thornton decided in his courtroom, the mining project would proceed unless physically prevented. Harrison tucked the tomahawk into his belt beside his pistol, feeling like a man preparing for a kind of warfare he had never imagined when he first rode up the mountain trail to investigate unauthorized hunting on his property. The transformation from wealthy rancher to armed defender of Native American land rights would have seemed impossible just months earlier. "You sure about this?" Samuel asked, studying Harrison's face in the lamplight that spilled from the cabin windows. "I've never been more sure of anything," Harrison replied, and meant it completely. Marcus emerged from the cabin carrying saddlebags packed with legal documents and supplies for what might become an extended conflict. His presence in this confrontation still amazed Harrison, the scholarly son who had shown no interest in ranch operations, was now fully committed to defending Samuel's family against men who would use violence to advance their business interests. "The marshals are meeting us at the courthouse," Marcus reported. "Judge Thornton wants armed protection for all parties during the hearing." Tommy appeared in the doorway, his small bow in one hand and a leather bag of arrows in the other. At 8 years old, he was too young to fully understand the danger they faced. But he had insisted on accompanying his father to what might be their family's most important day in court. "You stay close to your papa today, little wolf," Samuel told his son. "And remember what we talked about. Sometimes the bravest thing is knowing when not to fight." The ride to town took 2 hours through mountain trails that had become as familiar to Harrison as the paths around his own ranch house. But this morning, the landscape felt different, charged with potential violence and the knowledge that men with rifles were probably watching their progress from concealed positions. They met Judge Thornton and his marshals at the edge of town, where the official escort provided some protection, but also announced to everyone that this was no ordinary legal proceeding. Word had spread throughout the territory that Harrison Blackwood was supporting an Indian land claim against the interests of his own business class, and the courthouse was surrounded by curious spectators and interested parties. Inside, the hearing began with the formal presentation of Samuel's land deed and the supporting evidence they had gathered over the previous weeks. Harrison's lawyer, a competent man named Richardson, who specialized in territorial property law, methodically established the legal foundation for Samuel's claim, while Consolidated Development's attorneys raised every possible objection and procedural challenge. But the real drama began when Jake Morrison took the witness stand to testify about the economic necessity of the mining project and the dangers of allowing outdated agreements to prevent territorial development. "Mr. Blackwood has been deceived by romantic notions about Indian rights," Morrison testified, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who believed his position represented common sense and practical necessity. "The land in question has been unused for decades, and the territory's economic future depends on developing its natural resources." When Richardson began his cross-examination, the careful politeness of legal proceedings began to give way to something more personal and bitter. "Mr. Morrison, you state that the land has been unused," Richardson said. "Are you aware that Mr. Gray Arrow's family has maintained a seasonal camp there for more than 50 years? "I'm aware they've been camping illegally on private property," Morrison replied. "Squatters' rights don't override legitimate development interests. Private property owned by whom?" Morrison hesitated slightly, perhaps recognizing the trap that Richardson was setting. "By the territorial government, held in trust for appropriate development. But if Mr. Gray Arrow's treaty is valid, then the territorial government never had the right to dispose of that land in the first place, did it?" The legal argument continued for another hour, but Harrison could see from Judge Thornton's expression that the evidence was weighing heavily in Samuel's favor. The land deed was authentic, the continuous use could be documented, and the legal precedent supported upholding treaties that had been properly executed and witnessed. What Harrison could not see from his position in the courthouse was the crowd of armed men gathering outside, or the signals being passed between Jake Morrison's associates who had positioned themselves throughout the courtroom. The first sign of trouble came when one of the territorial marshals quietly approached Judge Thornton's bench and whispered something that made the judge's expression grow grim. "Ladies and gentlemen," Judge Thornton announced, "I'm going to call a brief recess to address some security concerns. Everyone please remain seated until further notice." But the recess announcement seemed to trigger rather than prevent the confrontation that had been building throughout the morning. Harrison heard shouting from outside the courthouse, followed by the unmistakable sound of breaking glass and the crash of overturned furniture. Samuel rose from his seat with the fluid alertness of someone who had learned to recognize danger in all its forms. Tommy moved immediately to his father's side, clutching his small bow with the serious expression of a child who understood that the grown-up games had suddenly become real. "Stay together," Harrison told Marcus and Samuel as the courtroom erupted in confusion and people began pushing toward the exits. "Whatever happens, we don't get separated." Through the courthouse windows, Harrison could see Jake Morrison's hired men confronting territorial marshals in what appeared to be a coordinated effort to disrupt the legal proceedings. Some of the men carried rifles, others had tools that could serve as weapons, and all of them wore the grim expressions of people who had been told that their livelihoods depended on preventing Judge Thornton from issuing his ruling. "They're trying to stop the hearing," Marcus observed with the analytical clarity he brought to problems that interested him. "If they can create enough chaos, they might be able to claim that the legal process was compromised." Samuel moved toward the windows to assess the situation outside, his hand resting on the knife he wore at his belt. "More than that," he said quietly. "They're planning to settle this outside the courthouse. Regardless of what the judge decides," the realization hit Harrison with cold certainty. Consolidated Development had never intended to accept an adverse legal ruling. The courthouse hearing was merely a formality to be endured, while their real solution was being implemented through intimidation and violence. "Judge Thornton," Harrison called across the increasingly chaotic courtroom, "you need to issue your ruling now, while there's still time to make it official." The judge looked up from his consultation with the marshals, recognizing the urgency in Harrison's voice. "Mr. Blackwood, I appreciate your concern, but proper legal procedure—" His words were interrupted by the sound of gunshots from somewhere outside the building, followed by screaming and the crash of more breaking glass. Whatever confrontation Jake Morrison's men had planned was now underway, and the time for legal niceties was rapidly running out. Judge Thornton made his decision with the speed of someone who had learned to recognize when circumstances required immediate action rather than careful deliberation. "In the matter of Gray Arrow versus Consolidated Development," he announced in a voice that carried throughout the courtroom, "I find that the plaintiff's land deed is valid and binding, and that the defendants have no legal right to develop the property in question without the explicit consent of the treaty holders." The ruling should have been a moment of victory for Samuel and his supporters, but it was immediately overshadowed by the realization that legal victory might be meaningless if they could not survive the violence that was erupting around them. "Now, we find out if laws mean anything when powerful men don't want to follow them," Samuel said grimly, checking his weapons and preparing to fight for the legal rights that Judge Thornton had just confirmed belonged to his family. The campfire ember glowed like a tiny star fallen to earth, its warm light pulsing with each breath of wind that swept down from the mountain peaks. Tommy had been tending the fire since before dawn, feeding it carefully chosen twigs and branches, while his father and Harrison stood guard over their makeshift camp in the disputed valley. 3 days had passed since the courthouse confrontation, and they had not returned to the safety of town or Harrison's ranch house. Instead, they had taken refuge in Samuel's traditional hunting grounds, the very land that Judge Thornton's ruling had confirmed belonged to Samuel's family, but that Jake Morrison and Consolidated Development were determined to claim through force. The violence outside the courthouse had been brief but decisive. Morrison's hired men had attempted to prevent Judge Thornton from issuing his ruling by creating a riot that would have provided justification for declaring the legal proceedings invalid. But the territorial marshals had been prepared for such tactics, and the confrontation had ended with several arrests and Morrison himself fleeing town rather than facing charges for conspiracy to interfere with judicial proceedings. However, legal victory in the courthouse had not ended the practical conflict over the land. Morrison and his remaining associates had retreated to the mountains, where they were conducting what amounted to a guerrilla campaign to drive Samuel's family from their hunting grounds, regardless of what territorial courts had decided. Movement on the ridge Samuel announced quietly, pointing toward a line of trees where Harrison's untrained eyes could detect nothing unusual. Harrison studied the area Samuel had indicated, trying to apply the tracking and observation skills he had learned over the past months. Gradually, he began to make out subtle signs, a shadow that moved slightly against the natural pattern of tree branches, a flash of reflected sunlight from what might be a rifle barrel. "How many?" Harrison asked, checking his own weapons with the careful precision Samuel had taught him. "At least 3, maybe more," Samuel replied. "They're trying to get above us, probably planning to attack at first light." Marcus looked up from the legal documents he had been organizing by firelight, his scholarly habits persisting even in these desperate circumstances. "If they attack us here, they'll be committing assault on land that a territorial judge has ruled belongs to us. That should carry serious legal consequences only if there are witnesses left to testify," Samuel replied grimly. The simple statement carried implications that none of them wanted to examine too closely. Morrison's men were not planning a confrontation that would be resolved through legal channels. They intended to eliminate the people who could enforce Judge Thornton's ruling. Tommy stirred the campfire ember with a stick, sending sparks dancing up into the darkness. "Papa, why do the bad men want our land so much? There are lots of other places they could dig for rocks." Samuel's expression softened as he looked at his son. But his answer carried the weight of experience with the way powerful men made decisions about other people's lives. "Because they think they can take it, little wolf. Some people believe that having money gives them the right to take whatever they want from people who have less." Harrison found himself thinking about privilege and power in ways that his comfortable upbringing had never required. He had always assumed that legal systems and social institutions existed to protect legitimate rights and resolve disputes fairly. But here in the mountains, facing men who were willing to use violence to override legal judgments, he was learning that justice sometimes had to be defended with more than legal documents and moral arguments. "They're moving closer," Samuel observed, his trained senses detecting signs of approach that remained invisible to Harrison, despite months of instruction. "We need to decide whether we're going to try to slip away in the darkness or make our stand here." The choice was more complex than it might have seemed to an outside observer. Retreating might preserve their lives, but it would also concede the practical control of the land to Morrison's forces, regardless of what Judge Thornton had ruled. Making a stand might result in violence that could cost lives, but it would also demonstrate that legal rights were worth defending, even when that defense required personal risk. "What do you think, Marcus?" Harrison asked his son, recognizing that this decision would shape not just their immediate survival, but the kind of men they chose. To be in the face of serious moral challenges, Marcus looked up from his documents with the serious expression he wore when wrestling with difficult intellectual problems. "Judge Thornton's ruling is meaningless if we don't have the courage to enforce it," he said slowly. "But I also think we need to be smart about how we defend ourselves." "What do you mean?" Samuel asked. "I mean, we don't just wait here for them to attack us," Marcus replied. "We use the advantages this land gives us, the knowledge Papa has taught Father about moving quietly, reading signs, understanding the terrain better than people who are only here to cause trouble." Harrison felt a surge of pride in his son's analysis. Marcus had grasped not just the immediate tactical situation, but the larger principle at stake, that the land itself and the knowledge required to understand and use it properly provided the foundation for legitimate claims that transcended simple power struggles. Over the next hour, they developed a plan that combined Samuel's wilderness skills with Harrison's resources and Marcus's analytical thinking. Rather than waiting passively for attack, they would use their intimate knowledge of the valley to turn the tables on Morrison's men, demonstrating that legal ownership backed by practical competence could overcome illegal force backed by hired guns. Tommy's role in their plan was crucial. His small size and Natural stealth made him ideal for carrying messages and observing enemy movements without being detected. Despite his father's obvious reluctance to involve an 8-year-old boy in such dangerous activity, Samuel recognized that Tommy's skills and courage made him a valuable ally, rather than simply someone who needed protection. "Remember what we practiced about moving without sound," Samuel told his son as they prepared to implement their plan. "And remember that being brave doesn't mean being reckless." "I remember, Papa," Tommy replied, with the serious dignity of a child who understood that he was being trusted with adult responsibilities. The quiet step, the patient eye, the careful heart, as they separated to take their positions around the valley. Harrison found himself carrying the tomahawk Samuel had given him alongside his rifle and pistol. The traditional weapon had come to represent something more than just another tool for defense. It symbolized his acceptance of Samuel's way of understanding the relationship between people and land, his willingness to fight for principles that transcended immediate self-interest. The attack came just before dawn, as Samuel had predicted. Morrison's men moved down from the ridge in a coordinated assault, designed to overwhelm their small camp through superior numbers and firepower. But instead of finding 3 men huddled around a campfire, they discovered that their targets had anticipated their strategy and prepared an appropriate response. Harrison's first shot came from a concealed position among the rocks above the valley floor, taking down one of Morrison's men before the attackers realized their approach had been detected. Samuel's rifle spoke almost simultaneously from the opposite side of the valley, and Marcus added his own contribution from a third angle that had been carefully chosen to create crossfire without endangering his allies. But it was Tommy who delivered the most decisive blow, not through violence, but through the kind of precise action that demonstrated the superiority of knowledge over force. Following his father's instructions, the boy had used his stealth skills to approach Morrison's position from behind, removing the firing pins from several rifles and scattering the ammunition that the hired men had assumed would be available when needed. The battle was brief, but decisive. Morrison's men found themselves outmaneuvered by opponents who understood the terrain, outfought by people defending something they valued more than money, and ultimately defeated by the simple fact that legal right backed by practical competence proved stronger than illegal force backed by economic power. When the shooting stopped, Jake Morrison himself lay wounded among the rocks, his hired men either dead, wounded, or fled. The man who had been Harrison's trusted foreman for 8 years looked up at his former employer with a mixture of pain and bewilderment. "You threw it all away." "Harrison," Morrison said through gritted teeth, "everything we built together, all for some Indian's old papers and romantic notions about the past." Harrison looked down at the man who had helped him build his ranch empire, feeling not triumph but sadness for relationships that had been destroyed by conflicting visions of progress and justice. "I didn't throw anything away, Jake," Harrison replied quietly. "I finally figured out what was worth keeping." As the sun rose over the valley where Samuel's family had hunted for generations, the campfire ember continued to glow among the ashes. A small, constant light that had survived the darkness and violence of the night to welcome the new day. The handmade bow lay across Tommy's lap like a bridge between 2 worlds, its smooth curves representing the marriage of Samuel's traditional craftsmanship with Harrison's modern resources and Marcus's scholarly understanding of engineering principles. They had worked on it together during the long winter months following their victory over consolidated development. 3 generations of teachers and students creating something that none of them could have accomplished alone. "Try the draw again," Samuel encouraged as Tommy fitted an arrow to the string with movements that had become fluid through months of practice. "Remember what Mr. Harrison taught you about breathing and what Marcus showed you about calculating distance." The shot flew true, striking the target they had set up near the stream with an accuracy that would have seemed impossible when Harrison first witnessed Tommy's clumsy attempts at archery nearly a year earlier. But more important than the technical improvement was the confidence the boy carried. Now the assurance of someone who had learned valuable skills from people who cared about his development as a person rather than simply his performance of specific tasks. Harrison watched this demonstration with the satisfaction of someone who had discovered that teaching could be as rewarding as any business success he had achieved. Over the past months, his relationship with Tommy had evolved into something like the bond he had always wished for with Marcus, built on shared activities, mutual respect, and the gradual transfer of knowledge from one generation to the next. "Your turn, Marcus," Samuel said, offering the bow to Harrison's son. Marcus accepted the weapon with the careful respect he had learned to show for Samuel's traditional tools and methods. His own archery had improved dramatically over the winter, but more importantly, he had found ways to connect his scholarly interests with practical applications that served the community they were building around Samuel's hunting grounds. The legal victory that had established Samuel's family's rights to their ancestral lands had become the foundation for something larger and more significant than anyone had initially envisioned. Rather than simply preserving the status quo, Judge Thornton's ruling had created opportunities for new forms of cooperation between the traditional knowledge Samuel represented and the resources and connections that Harrison could provide. The first manifestation of this cooperation had been the establishment of what Marcus had dubbed the Valley School, an informal educational program that brought together Samuel's wilderness skills with Harrison's business experience and Marcus's academic training. Young people from the surrounding settlements came to learn tracking, hunting, weather prediction, and land management techniques that were disappearing from frontier communities as they became more urbanized and industrialized. But the school served adult students as well. Harrison had discovered that many of his fellow ranchers were interested in learning the sustainable land management practices that Samuel's people had developed over generations of living in close relationship with their environment. What had begun as friendship between two men had grown into a community resource that benefited everyone who was willing to approach it with appropriate respect and humility. "The bow feels different now," Marcus observed as he prepared for his own shot. "More balanced somehow." "That's because it was made for you specifically," Samuel explained. "Your father measured your arm length and draw strength. I selected wood that matched your personality, and Tommy helped with the final shaping. It's not just a tool, it's a reflection of who you are and who you're becoming." The concept of craftsmanship as a form of relationship had been one of the most profound lessons Harrison had learned through his friendship with Samuel. In his business world, value was measured by efficiency and profit margins. But Samuel's approach suggested that the most valuable things were created through patience, attention to individual needs, and the investment of personal care that could not be mass-produced or purchased with money. Marcus's shot struck the target near the center, earning approving nods from his teachers and a spontaneous cheer from Tommy. The boy had appointed himself official encourager for all archery students, regardless of their age or skill level, bringing the same generous spirit to teaching that his father demonstrated in all his interactions with students. "Not bad for a city boy," Harrison teased his son, using an old joke that no longer carried any sting of disappointment or criticism. "Not bad for an old rancher either," Marcus replied, watching his father prepare for his own demonstration shot. The easy banter between them represented one of the most significant changes that had emerged from Harrison's friendship with Samuel. His relationship with Marcus had been transformed from a series of arguments about family obligation and career expectations into genuine companionship based on shared interests and mutual respect. Marcus had indeed chosen not to take over the ranch operations in the traditional sense that Harrison had originally envisioned. Instead, he had developed his own role as a bridge between the indigenous knowledge that Samuel represented and the broader community that could benefit from learning traditional approaches to sustainable living. His scholarly skills had proved invaluable in documenting and organizing information that had previously existed only in the memories of elders like Samuel. "Speaking of not bad for old ranchers," Samuel said with the gentle humor that characterized his approach to most of life's challenges. "I think you've earned the right to try the advanced target today." He pointed toward a more distant target that they had set up for experienced archers, a small circle of bark attached to a tree trunk almost 50 yards away. Harrison had been working toward this challenge for months, gradually building the strength and accuracy that such a shot required. As Harrison nocked his arrow and began the careful process of aiming that Samuel had taught him, he found himself thinking about patience and its various rewards. A year ago, he would have been frustrated by any activity that could not be mastered quickly through determination and resources. Now he understood that some accomplishments required the gradual development of skills and sensitivity that could not be hurried or purchased. The arrow flew in a smooth arc that carried it directly to the center of the distant target, earning congratulations from his teachers and the satisfaction of knowing that he had achieved something through dedicated practice rather than natural talent or inherited advantage. "Now, Tommy," Samuel said, "show Mr. Harrison and Marcus the special thing you've been working on." Tommy retrieved his own bow and moved to a position closer to the stream, where a more challenging target awaited, a small wooden disc suspended from a tree branch so that it swayed gently in the breeze. This was the kind of moving target that required not just accuracy, but timing and the ability to predict movement patterns. The boy drew his bow with the fluid motion that had become second nature, paused to read the rhythm of the swaying target, and released his arrow at precisely the moment when his calculations told him it would intersect with the disc's movement. The arrow struck true, setting the target spinning and earning applause from his adult audience. "That's the most impressive archery demonstration I've seen from any student," Marcus declared. And Harrison could tell from his son's expression that the praise was completely sincere. As they gathered their equipment and prepared to return to Samuel's cabin for the evening meal, Harrison reflected on the community they had built around the simple foundation of friendship and mutual respect. The Valley School had attracted students from throughout the territory, creating a network of relationships that transcended the usual divisions of race, class, and economic interest. Judge Thornton visited regularly, bringing legal scholars who were interested in studying the precedent his ruling had established for recognizing indigenous land rights. Eleanor had overcome her initial skepticism about Harrison's mountain friendships and had become one of Samuel's most enthusiastic supporters, organizing fundraising efforts for the school and helping to establish formal recognition for the educational programs they offered. Even Jake Morrison, after recovering from his wounds and serving a brief jail sentence for his role in the attempted violence, had approached Harrison about the possibility of learning some of Samuel's land management techniques. The reconciliation between the two men was still tentative and incomplete, but it represented hope that conflicts based on misunderstanding and prejudice could sometimes be resolved through patient effort and good faith on both sides. "You know what the best part of today was?" Tommy asked as they walked back toward the cabin through the gathering dusk. "What's that, little wolf?" Samuel replied, "Everyone learned something from everyone else," Tommy said, with the wisdom that sometimes emerged from children who had been raised to value knowledge over competition. "Mr. Harrison learned about patience from you, Papa. Marcus learned about traditions from all of us. And I learned about friendship from everybody." The simple observation captured something essential about what they had created. Together, a community based on the understanding that everyone had something to teach and something to learn. That knowledge was most valuable when it was shared, and that the relationships formed through learning together were often more precious than any specific skills that might be acquired. As they settled around the dinner table in Samuel's cabin, surrounded by the tools and weapons they had crafted together, the photographs and documents that told the story of their legal victory, and the friendship that had made all of it possible. Harrison understood that he had finally found the legacy he wanted to leave for his son. It was not the ranch empire or the accumulated wealth that his father had passed down to him, though those remained valuable assets. Instead, it was the knowledge that some forms of wealth could not be owned or inherited, but had to be earned through dedication, humility, and the courage to defend what truly mattered when powerful forces threatened to destroy. The handmade bow that Tommy carried represented all of these lessons in physical form, a tool created through cooperation, perfected through practice, and imbued with the care and attention that transformed mere objects into treasures that could be passed from one generation to the next with pride and confidence in their enduring value. Outside the cabin windows, the first stars were appearing over the valley, where Samuel's family had hunted for generations and would continue to hunt for generations to come, protected now not just by ancient traditions, but by the friendship of people who understood that some things were worth more than money, more important than progress, and more lasting than the temporary advantages that power and privilege could provide. In the morning, they would return to their various responsibilities. Harrison to his ranch operations, Marcus to his documentation projects, Samuel to his seasonal hunting and teaching duties, and Tommy to the continuing education that would prepare him to carry forward the best of what he had learned from all his teachers. But tonight they were simply a family of choice, bound together by shared struggles and mutual respect rather than blood or obligation. The fire crackled in Samuel's stone hearth, casting warm light on faces that had been weathered by mountain winds and marked by experiences that none of them could have imagined when Harrison first rode up the trail to investigate unauthorized hunting on his property. Tommy fell asleep in his father's arms, while the adults continued their quiet conversation about plans for the coming season, dreams for the future of their community, and gratitude for the friendship that had transformed all their lives in ways they were still discovering. As Harrison prepared to ride home to his own family and responsibilities, he carried with him not just the skills Samuel had taught him or the satisfaction of their legal victory, but the deeper understanding that true wealth lay in relationships that honored the best in everyone involved. The boy who had been searching for approval through material success had finally become the man who understood that some forms of inheritance could not be bought, sold, or stolen, only earned through the patient cultivation of wisdom, courage, and love. The handmade bow that represented their shared accomplishment would remain in Tommy's hands, ready to teach new students and create new friendships, ensuring that the lessons learned in this mountain valley would continue to spread outward into a world that desperately needed to remember what Samuel's grandfather had always known, that the land belonged to everyone who approached it with proper respect, and that everyone belonged to the land when they understood their place in the great community of all living things.